Hello dear friends, welcome to my channel Literary Sparks. This is the first video in a series that will deal with the history of English literature. So I will discuss in upcoming videos in detail what are the major periods in English literature, what are the important social, political, historical, literary events, incidents of a particular period, why a period is called so, what are the major characteristics, features in the writings of a particular period, what are the major writers as well as the minor writers, and in addition to that, what are the major classics of English literature that are often asked in the competitive exams. So whether you are preparing for assistant teacher, TGT, PGT exams for high school, or you are preparing for assistant professor exam for college level, or it is NET or GATE or SET of various states, or even if you are enrolled in an undergraduate or postgraduate degree, having the background knowledge of history of English literature is very, very important. So in this video, we'll quickly have the overview of the major periods of history of literature, what are the major writers in a particular age, and the time is one of that. So this video is going to be very, very helpful for your upcoming exams. So be there till the end. Let's start. So if you look at the history of English literature, it is divided into particular periods. The first period we have is the Old English period, which is also known as Anglo-Saxon period, which is spans from 1450 to 1066. Now, why the period is called Anglo-Saxon? So the term Anglo-Saxon, it comes from the names the Angles and the Saxons. These were two Germanic tribes, and they invaded Celtic England along with Jutes. So there were three Germanic tribes, Angles, Saxon, and Jutes, who invaded England around the year 450. So with that, the Anglo-Saxon period or Old English period in history of English literature, it began. And where did it end? It ended in 1066 when William of Normandy from France, who is also known as William the Conqueror, he conquered England. So at that time it ended, and the major features of this period, Old English period, that it was dominated by elegiac poetry, heroic poetry, love poetry, war poems, and then of course it was dominant by oral literature. So who are the major poets in this Old English period? First is the Beowulf poet. Beowulf is the famous Anglo-Saxon epic. Then the writer of this epic is unknown, he is anonymous. Then we have Cadman, Senior, and King Alfred. Next come Middle English period. Middle English period, it spans from 1066 to 1500. And now try to understand that this time span, like 1500 ends the Middle English period. Sometimes it will be considered that 1485 is also the end of Middle English period. The thing is that these periodization of the history of English literature has been done by the critics to study the literary periods. So it may happen that a particular period sometimes overlaps with other periods. So there are no fixed and finalized year, but we consider those particular years which are very, very crucial and where the major changes happen. So Middle English period 1066 to 1500. Now we divide this period into subcategories for our convenience. First, we have Anglo-Norman period, or what we call early Middle English period, that is from 1066 to 1350. Then we have Age of Chaucer, Geoffrey Chaucer, 1350 to 1400. Then we have Dark Middle Age, 1400 to 1415. So this time span, there was like scarcity, not many literary works were produced, so it is called Dark Middle Age. Then we have Revival of Learning, 1450 to 1500, and this time this was the coming of the Renaissance. So there was a growing interest in learning, in knowledge. So let us look what are the major trends in Middle English period. So we see religious and didactic poetry, alliterative poems. Alliteration is the repetition of consonant sound at the beginning of successive words. So in a video on on rhetoric, the major figure of speech I will discuss with that. Then metrical romances we have. Now, what the major poets in Middle English period? The Pearl poet, again, Pearl is poem. It was written by an anonymous poet, and that poet is known by his work Pearl Poet. Then, obviously, Geoffrey Chaucer is the dominant literary personality of this period. Then, William Langland, John Gower, John Barber. We have Thomas of Clay, King James the First of Scotland. See, later we have James the First of England, that Jacobean is named after him. But here, King James the First, he is of Scotland. He is a different person. Then we have William Dunbar, Robert Henryson, Sir John Mandeville, John Wycliffe, Sir Thomas Mallory, and William Caxton. Caxton famous for introducing the printing press in England. Then also the English plays also emerged during this period, so it's very important. Miracle plays, which are also sometimes known as saints plays, then mystery play, morality play, and interludes. In interludes, John Heward is the most dominant figure. Then come the Renaissance period, and which is also referred to sometimes early modern period. So what we have today as the English language that began during the Renaissance period, that is why we call it early modern period. So it spans from roughly 1500 to 1660. See, now this period, this is a huge period, a huge time span. It is subdivided into many categories. So the first category we have is early Tudor period. It is from 1485 to 1558, and the major writers in this time period are Erasmus, Sir Thomas More. Then there were writers who translated the Bible into English. Among them, the famous are William Tyndale, Miles Coverdale, but John Wycliffe was the first writer to translate English, the Bible into the English language. That he was in the Middle English period. Then we have Sir Thomas Yard and Henry Howard, who introduced sonnet into in England. Then Roger Ascham. Now, Tudor period, this from 1485 to 1603, it is named after the Tudor dynasty. So we have Henry the Seventh, Henry the Eighth, Edward the Sixth, Mary the First, and Queen Elizabeth the First. So these queens and kings, they belong to a particular dynasty that was called Tudor. That is why we call it Tudor period. So now we comes to the Elizabethan period, the most fruitful of the Renaissance period, and also it is known as William Shakespeare, the giant of literary writers. So it spans from 1558 to 1603, and it is named after Queen Elizabeth. So she reigned during this time period. It was the golden age of English drama. So drama, it became so affluent that there were so many playwrights during this time period. So the major writers of Elizabethan period, we have Sir Philip Sidney, Edmund Spenser, Sir Walter Raleigh, Samuel Daniel, Michael Drayton, George Chapman, Sir Francis Bacon, Nicholas Woodall, Thomas Sackville and Thomas Norton, Christopher Marlowe, and obviously William Shakespeare. Then we have Jacobean period from 1603 to 1625. During that time, King James the First of England, he reigned. Now, why this called Jacobean? Jacobean is the adjective of Jacobus, and Jacobus is the Latin name for James. Now, what the major writers in the Jacobean period? John Donne, the father of the metaphysical poets. Then King James's Bible, or authorized version of Bible, was published in 1611. This was a major achievement in English prose. Then obviously William Shakespeare, his later works also come under Jacobean period. Then Ben Jonson, John Webster. Now we come to the Caroline period, which spans from 1625 to 1649, and again this name comes from King Charles the First, who reigned in this period. And Caroline, it is the adjective of Carolus, which is a Latin name for Charles. So the major writers during these periods, we have George Herbert, Henry Vaughan. Cavalier poets, among Cavalier poets, the famous Robert Herrick, Richard Lovelace, Thomas Carey, Sir John Suckling, John Milton, Sir Thomas Browne, and Robert Burton. Then comes the Commonwealth period of Puritan interregnum, 1649 to 1660. Now, why this is called interregnum? Interregnum, it is a Latin word which means a period or gap in the government. So, when there is no king on the throne, that period is called Puritan. So, this time period, there was the dominance of the Puritans. Oliver Cromwell, who was a Puritan, he led the parliament and he ruled the nation. So it is called Puritan interregnum. And the Commonwealth period, it was the Commonwealth time. Now it was the period between the end of English Civil War. So already there was a civil war between the monarchs and the Commonwealth people, Puritans, and the restoration of Stuart monarchy. So in 1660, there will be the restoration. Now the major writers we have during this time period are Abraham Cowley, Andrew Marvell, John Milton, Thomas Hobbes, Thomas Fuller. And the important thing is that all the public theaters were closed during this time period. So we don't have any significant playwright in this time period. Next, we come to the Neoclassical period, 1660 to 1785, or sometimes 1798, also consider. So, Neoclassical, why? The original classical was the age in Greek and Latin, that was the classical literature. So, the writers of this time period, they imitated the classical writers, that's why this age is called Neoclassical period. Now, this age also had three subcategories. First is the Restoration period, which is also known as Age of Dryden, from 1660 to 1700. So it was what was the restoration? It was the restoration of the monarchy. So Charles the First, he was beheaded during the Puritan age. Then Charles the Second, he returned from France. He was in banishment during that Commonwealth period, and when he returned, the monarchy was restored. So it was the Restoration age. The major writers we have during this time period are John Dryden, Samuel Butler, John Bunyan, William Congreve, William Wycherley, George Etheredge, Ephraim, and John Locke. See, this Samuel Butler, there was another Samuel Butler who was the late Victorian novelist. He is a different person, and here Samuel Butler is also a Puritan. He is a different person. Next, we have Augustan period or Age of Pope from 1700 to 1745, and the major writers we have obviously Alexander Pope. That's why the age is called Age of Pope. Jonathan Swift, Joseph Addison, Sir Richard Steele, who perfected the periodical essay in this period. Then Daniel Defoe. Then next, the third category of the Neoclassical period, we have Age of Sensibility, which is also known as Age of Johnson or Transitional period. So this time there was a transition from the Neoclassical, the classical concepts to Romantic ideas. So there was a kind of transition, and it extends from 1745 to 1785. So the major poets during this time, we have Samuel Johnson, and the transitional poets, they were also known as precursors of Romanticism or pre-Romantic poets. Among them, we have the most famous ones: James Thomson, Oliver Goldsmith, William Collins, William Cowper, William Blake. And about Blake, it is said that he was more romantic than the Romantic. So chronologically, he belonged to the Neoclassical period, but in his essence, in his content, in his treatment of his poetry writings, he is very, very romantic. Then Robert Burns, Thomas Percy, Thomas Gray, Edward Young. And this time period is particularly important for the emergence of the English novel. So we have first the four wheels of English novel, the famous writers Samuel Richardson, Henry Fielding, Tobias Smollett, and Laurence Stevens. Another female writer, novelist we have is Fanny Burney. So the prose writers of this time are Edmund Burke, Edward Gibbon, David Hume, James Boswell. And among the dramatists, we have Oliver Goldsmith and Richard Brinsley Sheridan. Next comes the Romantic period, which is spans from 1798 to 1837. Now, there are controversies regarding the beginning and the ending of this period. So, there many years are actually considered. First is the 1785. So, when Dr. Johnson died in December 1784, critics, they think that The age of sensibility came to an end and romantic period ends in 1785. Some people also consider the 1789 when the French Revolution began, and even some people they consider 1798, sorry, it should be 98, when the lyrical ballads was published. Now regarding the ending, there are 2 years. First is the 1832 when Sir Walter Scott died, and also the first Reform Bill was passed, or 1837 when Queen Victoria ascended the throne. So roughly we consider from 1798 to 1837 as the Romantic period. So the major writers in this period we have William Wordsworth, S.T. Coleridge, Lord Byron, P.B. Shelley, John Keats, Sir Walter Scott, Jane Austen, Mary Shelley, Charles Lamb, William Hazlitt, Thomas De Quincey, and also you see during this time period 1786 to 1800 there was the proliferation of Gothic novels. So this time period is particularly known as the Gothic era, and we have the Gothic novels writers Horace Walpole, William Beckford, Mrs. Annie Radcliffe, Matthew Gregory Lewis, Charles Robert Maturin, and William Godwin. Next, we have the Victorian period from 1837 to 1900 on, which is after the reign of Queen Victoria. So this time she reigned in England, and this time period also have two categorization. First is the age of the pre-Raphaelite from 1848 to 1860, then age of aestheticism and decadence from 1880 to 1901. So among the poets famous during the Victorian period, we have Alfred Tennyson, Robert Browning, Elizabeth Barrett Browning, Matthew Arnold, D.G. Rossetti, G.M. Hopkins. G.M. Hopkins, though he chronologically belonged to the Victorian period, but his works were published in the modern period, and he is considered a modernist in experimentation in his poetry. Among the novelists, we have Charles Dickens. So, Victorian period, it was the age of novels. There were so many novelists, and so many novels were written during this period. So, Charles Dickens, then W.M. Thackeray, Bronte sisters, Charlotte Bronte, Emily Bronte, Annie Bronte, George Eliot, George Meredith, Mrs. Elizabeth Gaskell. We have Thomas Hardy, Robert Louis Stevenson, then Benjamin Disraeli, and Samuel Butler. Then among the prose writers, we have Thomas Carlyle, Thomas Babington Macaulay, John Ruskin, Matthew Arnold, Walter Pater, John Stuart Mill, John Henry Newman, and of course Charles Darwin, whose The Origin of Species influenced the writer so greatly. Then among the dramatists, the major one we have Oscar Wilde. Then we come to the most important period, the modern age, which is spent from 1900 to 1945. Then we also categorize this modern age into two periods. First, we have the Edwardian period, 1900 to 1914, and this name comes after King Edward the Seventh, who reigned during this time period, 1900 to 1910. It was the period between Victoria's death and the outbreak of the World War One. So in 1914, there was the beginning of World War. So among the poets during this time period, we have A.E. Housman, Henry Newbold, Thomas Hardy, Edward Thomas, Alfred Noyes, then W.B. Yeats. Among the fiction writers, we have Rudyard Kipling, Arnold Bennett, H.G. Wells, Arthur Conan Doyle, Catherine Mansfield, John Galsworthy, Joseph Conrad, Ford Madox Ford. And among the major playwrights, we have G.B. Shaw, W.B. Yeats, James Hinch, Cian O'Casey, John Galsworthy, and J.M. Barrie. Now, the second period is Georgian period, which spans from 1910 to 1936, and this is named after George V, who reigned during this time period, 1910 to 1936. So the major poets that we have in the modern age: Edmund Blunden, D.H. Lawrence, Ralph Hodgson, Rupert Brooke, Robert Graves, John Masefield, John Drinkwater, Siegfried Sassoon, Wilfred Owen, W.H. Davis, Walter Tillman. And of course, the big giant of literary modernism, T.S. Eliot. Then we have a group of poets known as imagists like Ezra Pound, James Joyce, William Carlos Williams. Then we have leftist poets or Oxford poets, W.H. Auden, C.D. Lewis, Louis MacNeice. Stephen Spender, and Dylan Thomas. Among the novelists, we have E. M. Foster, James Joyce, Virginia Woolf, Dorothy Richardson, D. H. Lawrence, Aldous Huxley, George Orwell, J. R. R. Tolkien, G. K. Chesterton. Non-fiction writers, we have T.S. Eliot, I. Richards, William Empson, F. R. Lewis, Frank Garmer, Leighton Strachey, and A.C. Bradley. So during this time period of new criticism, it came into the literary scene. Among the playwrights in the modern age, we have T.S. Eliot, J.B. Priestley, Noel Coward, William Somerset Maugham, Christopher Fry, W. H. Warden, Christopher Research. And we come to the latest period in history of English literature, that is the postmodernism, that begins with the end of World War II in 1945, and it comes to the present time. So it is the most developed and most proliferated period of literature, and we have so many writers during this period. In poetry, we have movement poets like Philip Larkin, Tom Gunn, Donald Levy, D.J. Enright, John Wayne, Elizabeth Jennings, Robert Conquest. Then we have Edith Sitwell, Ted Hughes, Seema Sini, the Nobel awardee Geoffrey Hill, J. S. Spring, R. S. Thomas. In fiction, we have so many writers: Graham Greene, Evelyn Waugh, Lawrence Durrell, Joyce Carey, Kingsley Amis, Angus Wilson, Alan Sillitoe, William Golding, Anthony Burgess, Malcolm Bradbury, Graham Swift, John Fowles, Muriel Isberg, Iris Murdoch, Doris Lessing, Margaret Drabble, S. Byatt, David Law, J. G. Ballard, J. G. Farrell, Julian Barnes, Agatha Christie, Angela Carter, J.K. Rowling, the writer of Harry Potter series, Ian McKeon, Peter Ackroyd, Hilary Mantel. In non-fiction, we have Bertrand Russell, the Nobel Prize winner, Winston Churchill, Raymond Williams, Stuart Hall. In drama, we have absurd drama, among them Samuel Beckett, Harold Pinter, and Edward Albee. Edward Albee was an American writer. These three people were so popular. Then Edward Bond, Tom Stoppard, Arnold Wesker, John Osborne, John Arden, Peter Shepard, and Carol Churchill. So these were the major writers of the various periods of history of English literature. And now I recommend certain books to you for your convenience that you can go through to understand the history of literature. Edward Albert, History of English Literature; William J. Long, English Literature; W. H. Hudson, An Outline History of English Literature; Ronald Carter and John McRae, the Routledge History of English Literature, Britain and Ireland; and finally Pramod K. Nair, A Short History of English Literature. So friends, this was the categorization of the major periods of history of English literature and the major writers we have. So thank you for your patience that you have watched the video till the end. So this was the introductory video in a series, and in the upcoming videos I will deal with in very detail age wise. There will be discussion, then there will be writer wise discussion like Geoffrey Chaucer, then there will be the classics of English literature also. So to make sure that you don't miss any of this video, which will going to be very interesting, subscribe to the channel and press the bell icon. Thank you. Have a nice day.